Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange. Today I'm going to do a video recommending adult fantasy books for beginners, intermediate, and advanced readers. I really like to film my recommendation videos this way for SFF because when I was first getting into the genres, I was always looking for videos like this on YouTube and there weren't a lot out there. And for me, of course, it was great to have a lot of videos focused around reading for beginners, but eventually I wanted to know what to read next. I want to know which books were really complex and which ones were easy to get into. And so I just think it's a really fun way to structure the video. Hopefully you find this helpful regardless of where you're at in terms of your own fantasy reading. I have done this before for fantasy as well as for science fiction. So I'm going to have those videos linked in the cards and the description box if you want even more, because there won't be any repeats here. And yeah, hopefully this will be a lot of fun. Let's get started. Now, first, let's start with the beginner category. And when I say beginner, I'm really imagining someone who has never picked up an adult fantasy book, or maybe has only read one or two, but still feels kind of uncomfortable in the genre, or still getting their feet wet, and are just looking for books that are very accessible, very easy to understand, and explained in very simple terms. For the most part, I'm going to be including high fantasy on this list, but the first book is technically urban fantasy, but it's a kind of urban fantasy that will appeal to those of you that are interested in getting into more complex fantasy stories. That, of course, is Jade City by Fonda Lee, which is an Asian-inspired fantasy story set in a fictionalized nation where there is a substance called jade that gives people abilities that enhance their martial art techniques, and so it makes them stronger, faster. And this story specifically follows a family that is a bit of a mafia or a crime family in this state, and they are competing with other families for control over this jade substance. And this is a story that I want to recommend for a few reasons. First, it's very character focused, so it's much more about these complex families and their interdynamics between them, their relationships, and less so about the technical world building. There is a little bit of explanation behind the jade and the powers that it gives people, but as long as you know that the jade basically makes them more powerful and enhances their abilities, you pretty much know everything you need to in order to understand that aspect of the story. There is world building, and in the later books you do get to see more of the larger scope and not just the individual city that most of the story starts out in. But again, it's told in a very organic way, and I think that this book will appeal to those of you that just want to get very much connected to characters, because this story has the most complex, morally gray characters I have ever read. I love them so much because they do despicable things. There is so much backstabbing and twists and turns in the story, but at the same time, you cannot help but just cheer for these characters. You can't help but root for them at times, and you will be so morally conflicted reading this one. And so that's why I think this one works very well for beginners, because again, it's really about the characters, and the things that are brought up in the story are very much something that you would see in any story, any genre, and it's just very enticing. It's the kind of story that you'll just want to eat up, and it's very gossipy and delicious. It's full of action, and like I said, there's lots of surprises, twists and turns, things that you might not see coming, and I absolutely loved it. Highly recommend it. I think it's one of my all-time favorite series, and I just, yeah, would love more people to check it out. Now, if you want to go with some true high fantasy, I would recommend Sword of Kaigen by Emma Wang. And this is a standalone story, so very accessible in that regard, that is told from the perspective of a son and his mother. It takes place in an Asian-inspired nation once again, and particularly in a very remote setting where they are in a place where they need to protect their nation from other invading forces. So the son goes to school and is training in order to become a soldier, and then the story again is also told from the mother's perspective, who has an interesting past and is struggling with her role as a wife and mother and just coming to accept it. And this is a story that I like to recommend for a few reasons. First, it's a standalone, so that makes it a little bit more accessible, and the fact that you get a complete contained story in one book. I think that the character work is also very straightforward. You understand their motivations quite quickly, and there really isn't too much going on. This one does have a bit more of a magic system, but it's based off of elements and is very similar to something like The Last Airbender, if you're familiar with that TV show. So I think that as long as you understand the basic basic concept of fire and ice and all of that, you can very much go along with it. The action is very well told and very easy to follow, and it honestly reads a little bit like a TV show or movie, and so I think it's very easy to picture, and again, you don't get bogged down in the really nitty-gritty details of the magic system. And again, it's really a story about a mother and son, their relationship, and who they are as people. So I think that, like the last one, it's one that is just a story about people. So regardless of it being fantasy, again, it's very relatable. It has some good action scenes, and I just think is a really good place to start again. It really lays out the magic and the world in a very simple way to understand. If anything, it perhaps has more info dumps at the beginning, but I know when I was starting out with the genre, I actually found those very helpful. So hopefully you will enjoy those aspects as well. Finally, for the beginner category, we have Foundry Side by Robin Jackson Bennett, which again is the first book in his series. And this follows a young woman who works as a thief. At the beginning of the story, she steals something, and what she steals ends up having bigger ramifications. This is told in a magical urban setting where there are things called scribed objects, where basically people are able to code non-living objects to have different properties, and it tells them to do certain things. So the example people always give is that there are wheels on the carts, and the wheels are programmed or coded in order to tell it to move forward, and so that is how the carts move on their own, similar to our modern cars. And so this story does have more complex magic than the other two that I mentioned, and you do learn a lot more of it as you go, but I do think that this one is still accessible enough to be in the beginner category because that magic is well explained. This is a good example of a hard magic system, but again, I think that it's laid out in a way that is really approachable. So if you really want to know more about the magic systems in your books, if you're just craving, wanting that understanding, this is an excellent place to go. This is one that again has really good character work. It has a lot of humor, a lot of banter between the characters, and I really enjoyed where it went. I personally love the scribing in it. It was definitely something that appealed to me because while this is fantasy, it has that technical aspect to it. It has those hard to find rules, which you slowly learn as you go through the story. And again, it's laid out very nicely for you. And I found that to be very satisfying. This book has some good action, some good villains, and I definitely recommend it. I got to listen to it on audio, which is an excellent way to try it out. And yeah, I think that this one would definitely work for beginners. The most complex of the three in this category, but definitely still deserves a spot among the accessible books. Now let's move on to intermediate books, and for this category I'm basically considering it for readers that have already read a handful of fantasy books and are ready for something a little bit more complex. They're familiar with the genre and are ready to move on to something that is going to be perhaps a little bit more challenging. The first one I want to recommend is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang, and this is an Asian-inspired grimdark fantasy that follows a young orphan girl named Rin who works really hard and gets into a military school, and within the first book a war breaks out and she is forced to use her training and go and fight for her people. Now throughout this trilogy there is some really interesting magic introduced that involves shamanism and gods, and it's fairly well described. It's not laid out in the simplest terms. You as the reader learn about it as the characters go along and they figure out things for themselves. This book does have a school setting which makes it feel very approachable at first, and in some ways you could include it in the beginner category. However, I think that this book better belongs in the intermediate category because I think you'll appreciate it better once you have seen this book compared to other fantasy books that do similar things. This book takes a lot of the classic tropes of fantasy and turns them on their head. So again, it takes that classic school setting, but then it goes to a much darker place. This is definitely not Harry Potter. And in fact, this book is really grim and depressing. It is largely based off of true Chinese history involving some of the events surrounding the rape of Nanking. And so huge content warnings, lots of sexual assault, brutal killings and so many other things about the terrible things that happen in wars. So I like that this book is a really good place to start with grimdark, but I wouldn't necessarily think it should be your very first fantasy book, because I'll be honest, the first time I read The Poppy War, I liked it, but I didn't fully know where it was going, and I remember being disappointed when they left that school setting. The second time around, I reread it and absolutely loved it. It's become a favorite series of mine, and I think it's because I've since read so many more fantasy books and realized what the author was doing, that it was all very purposeful, and I just love this series. Would love you to check it out. Again, it's completed, and I found the entire series to be very satisfying with a really good ending, which is always a good thing to know going into a new series. The other books I want to include in this category were the Witcher books, and in some ways a lot of people would say that these books could be read by beginners, especially now that there's the Netflix TV show, but having read them myself, I think that they better belong in intermediate. So this of course is a translated Polish series that follows a man named Geralt, who is a witcher, or basically a monster hunter, and this story follows him and also a young girl named Ciri, who has a role in the world, and you start to see how her abilities start to play into the larger story. I don't want to give away too much of the plot if you aren't familiar with the overarching story. Now, this is a story you actually want to start with some short stories, the first one being The Last Wish. And for that alone, I think it belongs in the intermediate category, because for a lot of readers, including myself, short stories are not the most accessible. Yes, they are short, they should be easy to get through, but a lot of us really do prefer the novel format, and so I had to read this book, or attempt to read it, several times before I really got into it. And I'll be honest, getting into the TV show actually really helped with that. Once you've read that and the corresponding additional short story, you could move on to the first novel, which is Blood of Elves, and that's when I got really into this series. I would consider it to be intermediate also because of the writing. As I mentioned, it is translated, and I did find the writing to be a little bit awkward or clunky, or at least very different than what I would normally expect. I just didn't find myself very immersed in the story. I didn't find myself connecting to Geralt as much as I would have liked to. My love of Geralt honestly does come from the TV show and the video games, and so I think that this book will be more or less accessible depending on your familiarity with those other mediums. Certainly, if you are already very familiar and used to reading a lot of fantasy, this one is not hard to get into, but it can be a little bit tough if it's, again, like your first fantasy read, and that's why I really didn't feel comfortable putting in the beginner category. This is also a very classic piece of fantasy, which might appeal to a lot of you. For some people like myself, I actually prefer fantasy that is a little bit more different, a little bit more diverse, but I did like the fact that it was based off of Polish myth and culture, and definitely gave me insight into that Slavic country, and I did enjoy the details of the monsters themselves. So fun one to pick up, definitely lots to get into, lots of books to read through, and yeah, a lot of good adventures and stories to read for yourself. Now finally, we have made it to the advanced category, and these are books that I would not consider picking up until you feel very comfortable in the genre. These are books that definitely assume that you are familiar with the tropes and are very comfortable with picking up world building and magic systems in a very natural way. I always want to disclaim when I make these videos that these are not the most complex fantasy stories out there. Certainly you can come back and tell me about ones that have more complex world building and so forth, but simply these are ones that I wouldn't pick up until you're ready for them. So the first one I want to recommend is a personal favorite, and that is The Grace of Kings by Ken Liu. And this is another Asian-inspired fantasy. You're going to notice a theme in some of my favorites here. But this one is specifically based off of the Chinese dynasties, so looking at real historical events as inspiration. The story itself is fairly complex, but basically it follows two main people who are involved in a rebellion to overthrow the ruling empire. And the reason I want to include it in the advanced list is a few reasons. First is that it has a fairly large cast of characters. While there are these two characters that are very much the focal point of the story, you follow so many other characters, and there are a lot of names as well as places. This takes place over a large span of time and also over a wide nation. And so the story jumps around, and that can be a little bit off-putting to some readers because you don't spend a lot of time in one place. You are constantly moving around. And in a way, I consider this a character-driven story because it's very much a story of the people of this nation. But at the same time, again, because you're meeting so many people, you are constantly moving forward in the plot and story, you don't get to spend tons of time with these individual characters. But the author still does a fantastic job of making these side characters so fascinating. They all have little backstories and details that to me made them very memorable. In terms of magic system, there is very little in here. There are hints of what could be considered magic in this world, but this is very low on the magic scale. Instead, I'm more putting this in the advanced category because of the politics and just the scope of the story. It's very vast and broad. And again, the author does not really hold your hand and take you through it slowly. Instead, you are just on this expansive journey, and it's epic at scale. These books are big and I just love them so much. There are some fantastic characters in here and I just love the series so much. So highly recommend this one, personal favorite, but I really do think you should wait till you're comfortable in the genre and are used to a lot of fantasy politics and big cast of characters, multi points of view. But when you're ready for that, so worth your time, well worth getting into these chunky books. And we're on to the last book on this list, and that is Devil's Night Dawning by Damien Black, which is the first book in a large epic fantasy series that follows a cast of characters, but primarily we are following an exorcist priest and his assistant who go around and exorcise possessed people on the countryside. At the beginning of the story, they find out that there is a larger epic issue happening. I don't want to give away too much, and they are forced to go on an adventure and travel along the countryside to possibly save their country and nation. And so this again is a story that is very epic in scale. It follows several perspectives, including a knight as well as a woman and her handmaiden. And I think that this book should be in the advanced category for a few reasons. One being that the multi-point of view is one that I found to be a bit off-putting or confusing because you don't see how these characters really connect together in this first book. It's also very heavy in terms of historical information and religion. It gives you a lot of information, and I wouldn't necessarily call it info dumps, but you're just going to spend a lot of time learning about the history of this world. The religion is very much based off of Catholicism, and it's very heavy-handed. I, of course, loved the parts involving the possessions most, but that's only part of the story, and for the most part, this really did read like epic classic fantasy, which isn't always my personal taste. This was just very dense, very heavy. And of the books on this list, I gotta say, I didn't fully love this one, but I do think that it will appeal to those of you that really like a good, chunky, classic fantasy story. This one, again, is one you want to work up to, but if you enjoy it, there's more books in the series. And I like that this one is a little bit more underhyped than some of the other ones I'm mentioning on this list. So if you're interested in it and you're ready for it, definitely check it out for yourself. All right, we've finally made it to the end of this list, and I would love to hear from all of you. What did you think of my rankings? Would you put these books in different categories? I'd also love for you to recommend me books that you think are good for beginners, intermediates, and advanced readers, and let me know where you're at in your own reading. Where do you consider yourself as a fantasy reader? Don't forget, if you enjoyed this video, you can help me out with a thumbs up, sharing it around online, and hitting that notification bell. There's also more videos to check out, so links again in the description and cards. And if you're new to my channel, consider subscribing. I do a lot of recommendation videos for fantasy, science fiction, as well as horror and thrillers, and I would love you to stick around. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.